Hi, good afternoon, and welcome to this episode of Think and Discover. In this episode, I will be taking you into the journey of Fileless malware attack as evidenced by the different engagement where we have with our different customers. So walk with me through the journey as I expose to you, one, the evolution of malware attack over time, the anatomy of a fileless malware attack, the characteristics of how fileless malware attack happens, and most importantly, what you can do as an organization, as an individual to protect yourself and your organization against fileless malware attack. Let's go. So let's talk a little about malware. Before we even talk about fileless malware, let's even talk about malware. Did you know that the first malware, or what people know as computer virus, happened in the year 1971? Oh, yes, that was a long time ago. The name of the virus at the time was called Creeper, and that was like the very well known documented virus that ever existed. And ever since then, there has been all sorts of malware that has been in existence and coming up with different variants. So we now have viruses that are self-replicating. We have worms. We have Trojans, and each of them coming up with their own variants or their own characteristics. But again, all of these are known as malware. Malware. eh, don't think malware is something very big. Just think of malware as a software that has become malicious. So it's taken from malicious software. The malware has now become a malicious software, and that's what you know as your current malware. So again, malware is not a new thing. It has existed all the way from 1971. Your typical malware, as you may know, based on how it functions, it may require to run on a host program. It may not require to run on a host program. It writes to the registry because it's a software. So typically it has to write, it has to be installed on the system, on the hard drive as an executable file. So that means it must write to the registry, computer registry. It must have a hashing, MD5 hashing. And of course, in recent times now, we have different ransomware, which is like another variant of malware, where rather than just sending the malware to your system, typically the attackers now request for some sort of kickback or ransom to be able to ensure that you are able to recover your files back after you have been attacked. So this has been the evolution of malware. This has been the evolution of malware attacks over time. Now, the typical modus operandi of how malware operates will simply be that a user somehow, somewhere, will take that malicious software. It's whether it's coming from a phishing link, whether it's coming from a website that is not supposed to be, or a user simply use a USB to also plug it into his system. That's malware or malicious software gets installed on his system, runs, self-replicates, and then it's able to cause havoc on your system. Most times it even begins to go into other people's systems and begin to cause compromise across the organization. Now, this is a typical way or characteristics of how typical malicious software or malware happens. And let's come back to why we are here, which is speaking to fileless malware. You will notice that just like every typical malware attack, a fileless malware attack always starts from a user, a person who, whether incidentally or accidentally, clicks on a link, malicious link, and he's able to get that fileless malware. Now, this is where the difference happens. Against a typical malware, where you have the malware gets installed on the user system and runs on the hard drive as an executable, this fileless malware doesn't ever get installed. And I'll talk to you about what that really means. But again, that's the flow. So user clicks on the link, gets the fileless malware, it runs on his system. Typically, it runs using a couple of exploit development kits. And then from there, it pivots. It begins to affect files. It begins to affect its programs. And then, of course, the system is eventually compromised. So same flow with every typical malware. But in this context, with fileless malware, nothing ever gets installed. And that brings us to something that we're going to talk about, really. Why do we call this a fileless malware? Well, again, it's in the name, isn't it? Because it really doesn't have a file. It really never gets installed. Typically, for every software that you have in your system today, the typical process will be you would have to install it. It would have to run as an executable. It will have to get installed. It will have to be registered, so sort of form in the computer registry, and then you have it. For fileless malicious software, when a user gets this particular malware, it does not run on as an executable on the person's hard drive, but runs in the memory. What exactly that means is that typically you have your RAM, what people call your random access memory. You have your ROM, which is your hard drive. Each of these different memories that your system or your computer system needs to work. Your typical malware will have to run on your ROM, which people call your hard drive in your system. However, for fileless malware, it does not run on your ROM or your hard drive, but on your RAM, your memory. So essentially, it's more or less like injecting into your memories, injecting code into your random access memory, powering that fileless malware to get hidden within memory of your operating system. Another characteristics of your typical fileless malware is that it works with applications, already existing applications that are on your system. And I'll talk to you about one of those applications that uses PowerShell. Now, PowerShell is a very, very unique application that people use in their systems. Your typical administrators, for example, within your organization use PowerShell for carrying out administrative tasks, troubleshooting, and what have you. Now, because PowerShell is with high administrative or privileged access, your fileless malware is able to use PowerShell as a trusted application to be able to carry out havoc or cause compromise within your system. So because it knows that your system already trusts PowerShell, it knows that PowerShell runs an elevated access within your system, the fileless malware takes over or runs in the memory using PowerShell as a tool to be able to achieve its aim. Now, another characteristic of how your fileless malware works is that it doesn't run with MD5 hash algorithms. So you see, for every executable that runs within your organization, you find out that it is always some MD5 hashing that is always applied to every executable that runs. From fileless malware, this is never the case. So you don't typically see your hashing algorithms that are applied or attached to this particular kind of malware that is installed within your system. Then there is something else that we talk about, another characteristics, especially with fileless malware, which is that it also manipulates Windows registry. Now, with Windows registry manipulation, your attacker is using the file, taking advantage of a trusted Windows process. Now, if you look at your Windows registry, for example, you find that a couple of processes, or even your services, or your Windows registry, for every process that is running your computer or your system, every single application is tied to a particular process. And for every process that runs, is always tied to a particular account, whether it's a local account of the system or a service account or whatever kind of account it is. For every single application to run Windows, your operating system will have to trust that particular application to run. Most times, even assign it an ID, for example, for it to be able to run. And that usually happens. All of this and the details of the running of each of those processes are recorded on your Windows registry. Your fileless malware is able to take advantage of some of those trusted Windows processes and cause havoc. So when a user clicks on the link, for example, the Windows process, one of the issues, any of those Windows process, depending on what the attacker is using, is then used to write and execute each of those code within the fileless malware right into the registry. So the registry now sees the registry is not able to detect that a particular fileless malware does exist in the system because it is simply looking at all the processes within the system and it's already trusted the processes without knowing that your fileless malware is using one of those processes to run and it's able to execute within your system without creating for itself its own application in your system. So it is not creating a new application. It is not creating a new registry ID so as to say that, okay, this is something new that has come into the system and maybe I have to block it. Rather, it is using what is already existing an already existing process that is trusted by a Windows operating system for it to be able to carry out havoc. And these are a few among the many characteristics that you have that show how your typical fileless malware attack does happen. So now that we have identified the anatomy of a fileless malware attack, and more importantly, the characteristics of a typical fileless malware, it is now important for us to now focus now on how you as an individual, whether you are a system administrator, a security engineer, or a business owner of your organization, how you can protect yourself and your organization against this kind of attack. And again, in speaking about protection or practical approaches for protection, the typical thing that you would think that we will come up with will be, let's install a solution, let's put in place a tool to be able to block this. But guess what? The real and the most effective solution that you can ever think about when it comes to fileless and malware attack is to educate your people. Yes, you got that security awareness training. And I'll tell you why. Because you see, as I always say to people, you can have the best of technology, you can have the best of processes, but you see, your people are the most important as well as the weakest nation of information security. You should be able to educate them on this type of malware, because the more your people are aware, the more this kind of compromise will be less reduced and less effective within your system. You remember how I talked about the anatomy of a fileless malware attack? It always starts with the user. The user must first get the link. This link doesn't just appear automatically in your system. They don't just fly into your organization. They are always first introduced by a person, a user, your employee. So the first and most effective in protection against malware attack is always to educate the people, carrying out security training, awareness training for the people. And that's very important. Now, the next and also very important thing that must be focused on as practical approaches for protection is on the focus, especially when in protection. Now, typically, when security engineers work on identifying incidents, most times they always focus on what we call indicators of compromise. Now, you see, indicators of compromise is good, but you see, when the kind of malware attack we're looking at now is not looking at is something or is a software that is running or that you can be able to mash with a particular process that has actually happened, or a particular hash or algorithm that has been effective or in your registry. You're not looking for any file, because the truth is that nothing has actually been installed. So typically your indicators of compromise will be looking, what are the new things that were introduced into the system? What were the new processes that were introduced into your endpoints that brought about this kind of compromise? Those are the focus of indicators of compromise. The focus should be, especially for those who are incident analysts for organizations, should be on indicators of attack, what we call IOEs. When you focus more on indicators of attack, you're focusing less on the identity of the malware or the malicious software and more on the behavior of the malicious software. So your typical process, you know how we mentioned that your firewall malware always attaches itself to trusted processes. It always attaches itself to trusted applications. Now, when you focus on the behavior of your applications, it helps you to see something. If your typical application or process is supposed to do 1, 2, 3, 4 activities, which is the typical expected behavior from your application, the moment when there is a abnormal or pattern in behavioral change from either your process or your application, it should tell you that there should be something to bother about, because this is not how your application behaves. This is not how the particular process behaves. Something is wrong. It's the same process that you trusted, it's an application, but it has a different behavioral pattern. So that's why the focus, especially for incident analysts, when looking out for and identifying cases of fileless malware, will be to focus on the behavioral patterns of applications, and that's speaking to indicators of attacks rather than indicators of compromise. And that's one aspect they want to look at. Now, very important is to also look at threat hunting. So threat hunting is, I don't want to wait before I'm able to notice some indicators of attack. I don't want to wait until when I see changes in behavior of my typical trusted processes or applications. I want to hunt for them. So I'm always hunting. Okay, I am looking out for these things. So from time to time, I'm analyzing registries, I'm analyzing my Windows registry, I'm analyzing my logs, I'm analyzing the applications. I'm looking out for each of those things. So this is like more or less like an proactive approach rather than waiting back and looking at those indicators of attack that will do happen in a detective kind of approach. I want to be more proactive. So I want to go out there, either within my environment, within my network, or even my external surface, and look out for these kind of attack patterns. So I'm able to halt them before they even come into my environment and begin to compromise my organization. And the last and most important is the solution. You must use an advanced security endpoint solution. You see, your traditional antiviruses focused more on analyzing files, analyzing MD5 hash algorithms. They had a database in which they had all the different virus signatures of various kind of malware that you have in your that you could typically have. So when they scan your system, they are mapping or they are matching a virus signature or a signature of a particular application to any of the already detected virus signature that they have. If there is a match, they tell you that this is a virus. This is the typical way of traditional antivirus work. But again, this is not the typical way of fileless malware work because you really don't get to see a hash algorithm for a typical fileless malware. So your typical traditional antivirus, it's not going to detect that. And so you cannot use your typical antivirus solutions to be able to block you against your fileless malware. Now, organizations too, in the bid to try to circumvent that, they have begun to put in place some kind of processes. For example, they say stop using PowerShell. We talked about PowerShell, for example, as one very high-end administrative solution or software that is used by administrators. Say let's just ban it altogether. But again, why ban PowerShell? After all, it's used for good in the organization. So because the software has also used for bad, does that mean you should typically ban it? How about how the system administrators, how they're going to carry out the administrative functions, how they're going to carry out troubleshooting within the person's system? So in a bid to balance between security and user friendliness or the services, managing services and ensuring business continuity of the organization, you want to use a proper advanced endpoint detection and response solution. Your EDR solution is focused on helping you to achieve your security objectives. And one of the things that your typical EDR solution should do would be looking out for behavioral patterns. So rather than looking out for virus signatures, of course it will have virus signatures, but it's also looking out using artificial intelligence for behavioral patterns of your applications that are reside in the environment. So even trusted applications, trusted processes that you have, the moment when it starts saying that a particular trusted process has begun to escalate beyond what it's supposed to be. So if it's supposed to do 1, 2, 3, 4 activities or process, it begins to do what more than what it's supposed to do. Maybe to begin to pivot or begin to compromise other files or other systems. Your advanced EDR is supposed to identify that and even block it in the process. Maybe kill that particular process. That's essentially how it's going to do. Focusing on behavior rather than the identity of the typical files that will constitute a compromise within your organization. So organizations, when shopping for endpoint protection solutions, they would want to consider as part of the many offerings that your typical endpoint protection provider is going to provide to you, how effective is it against malware, and especially fileless malware. So when organizations put all of these things into perspective, ensure that your users educate your users, ensure that they are properly educated against this particular kind of virus or malware variants, and of course others, when they put in place a process to ensure that your incident analysis is not just focused on indicators of compromise, but indicators of attacks, focusing more on behavior of trusted applications and less on the identity of files or applications, When they also put in place process around managed threat hunting, looking out for hunting for these threats even before they carry out any form of attack. And most importantly, when they purchase and put in place and deploy a proper advanced endpoint protection and response solution, the organization can be able to assure itself that this particular fileless malware, although existent, although causing a lot of havoc within the organization, will not, at least to a reasonable extent, wreak havoc within the organization. All right. So we hope as much as possible that organizations will begin to put this in place. As much as possible that organizations and the security teams within the organization will begin to look in depth as to see how they can effectively protect themselves and the organizations against fileless malware attack. So thank you very much for joining me on this episode. I hope you truly enjoyed it, and I hope to see you on another episode of Sync and Discover with Ethnos.